Hello there, I'm Norma Levy. I'm president of New Plaza Cinema. We're a nonprofit organization. Today, we'll be discussing a 2003 mockumentary comedy called A Mighty Wind. It was directed by Christopher Guest and stars Eugene Levy and Bob Balaban. And now it's my great pleasure to turn this program over to our curator and host for the event, Gary Palmucci. Gary?
Okay, thank you, Norma. Well, for some reason, today in my house in Park Slope, Brooklyn, I'm unable to come to you via video from any corner of the house. Usually I can find some corner to do that. So let's just pretend this is some kind of a mishap at the town hall presentation that we saw in A Mighty Wind, and take it from there. I was recalling this week that about 40 years ago, scarily, I remember getting a call from a friend of mine in Houston, Texas, who ran a little art house theater down there, saying she had just seen a sneak preview of a movie called This Is Spinal Tap, which I had never heard of, although I knew some of the people who were participating in it, Rob Reiner, Christopher Guest, and his partners, with whom they went on to make several more mockumentaries. And over the years, they have frequently gone on various podcasts and radio shows saying they never saw a dime from This Is Spinal Tap, which has become a beloved cult film. It's been re-released many times in theaters by its purported owners. And they finally got the rights back, I think, in the last year or two, and they're making a sequel to This Is Spinal Tap, believe it or not. But in the meantime, we can savor this film today, A Mighty Wind, which I hadn't seen since it came out, and I found to be hilarious and having aged beautifully with jokes and actors who've gone on to the enrichment of the meaning of a lot of the humor in this film and their own careers as actors in the things they've given us since then. So, and I know Max and I spoke about this. He feels the same way. What sort of promo do we have to offer today, Max?
Well, greetings, Gary. And I like this old-time radio approach of hearing your voice, which kind of ties into the whole podcast thing, because eventually many of these talkbacks end up as podcasts. So it is wonderful to hear you today. Warner Brothers released A Mighty Wind in 2003, and that's a studio known for its gargantuan tentpole pictures. The smaller films always got rushed to the side or not greenlit. So it was unusual that Warner's would handle what was still considered a relatively inexpensive Hollywood film, only costing $6 million in 2003. We're going to show the original trailer for A Mighty Wind, which was produced by Castle Rock, which was the production company. One of the major principals there was Rob Reiner, who, of course, directed This Is Spinal Tap. So there was a long-term professional relationship with him and Christopher Guest and other principals. Let's see how Warner sold A Mighty Wind.
Finally, in the news tonight, the music world mourns the death of folk music icon Irving Steinblum. Steinblum managed the careers of the Main Street Singers, the Folksmen, and Mitch and Mickey.
The only fitting tribute that we could come up with was a memorial concert.
I'd like to think that Mitch would agree to do this, because I already said yes.
Well, there's a puppy in the parlor.
Folktown is the label to be on.
But they had no hole in the center of the records, and
yeah, if you punched a hole in them, you'd have a good time.
It's just that kind.
My dad, Fred Knox, was an original Main Street Singer.
He's a dead person now, but when he was alive, he was so happy.
There had been abuse in my family, but it was mostly musical in nature.
There's a kiss at the end of the rainbow.
Mitch was mysterious and intense.
I don't remember much.
We are so excited to be part of this project.
Oh, absolutely. It's something of a challenge for me because I don't like folk music.
Me too.
Quick plug, Ola. I'm Mike LaFontaine, owner and founder of High Class Management. Whoops!
I had a hit that you might have heard of, Hurleget Lille Gummen, which means how's it hanging, Grandma?
Those are lights hanging up there?
Yes, those are lights.
Could they fall?
And that's a ceiling above us.
Excuse me, I must be full. It's like that wire. I see a wire. I see a... Ow!
Mighty winds are blowing Across the land and across the sea, it's blowing peace and freedom.
I feel ready for a voyage on this magnificent vessel.
I love Mitch.
What if we see sailfish?
But
It's blowing you and me.
He got certainly a lot of the best bits into the trailer, I think.
It absolutely did. Very funny trailer, totally captures the hilarity and the spirit of the film. Like you, Gary, I hadn't seen it since it first came out, and I sat down the other night with a scholarly approach. I was all prepared to take all these copious notes, and I was so busy laughing, I forgot to take most of my notes, so I'm relying on my memory here.
Well, the only scene I remembered in the picture really was Harry Shearer's having to, burn time on the stage while they were looking for Eugene Levy and talking about the Spanish Civil War in 1938. But there's certainly 2 or 3 dozen classic bits of business there. We have to thank our colleague Abby Harris, who wasn't able to be here today in person, but she is a big fan of these 4 guys, or 3 guys actually. And they've made half a dozen films: Spinal Tap, Waiting for Guffman, Best in Show, Mighty Wind, For Your Consideration, and the most recent one called Mascots, which is a Netflix production that's still available on that channel. And the thing that she pointed out to me, maybe I knew this or I had forgotten it, and I'm still kind of flabbergasted that they pull this off. I mean, you can't say this is a big budget film, but it's not a low budget film either, it looks like to me, given everybody who's involved in it, shooting on location in New York and LA. But they really make a point of the fact that they have no real screenplay for these films. There is no written dialogue. There's no scene by scene type construction or whatever. There are some descriptions of the characters. There's obviously some kind of a plan. There has to be for the production schedule. There are note cards. But they are improvising pretty much all the way through the film, which kind of bowls me over in terms of how well this one came out.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I remember that Christopher Guest, around the time that Waiting for Guffman came out, was being interviewed. It might have been in one of the old film magazines. And someone asked him about the process of making his work. And he did say pretty much you were saying, that the dialogue was improvised. And I still find that impossible to believe. I mean, the timing and the cultural references and the sophistication of the comments that are so accurate for the characters. It's astonishing to me.
And how many takes they really need to get. They can't really have the leisure for tons of takes. I would imagine probably a lot of rehearsal must go on. And even though there's no script that they're reading from, they've got some kind of a template, I would think, or some of the things are just concise 2 or 3 liners that have a great payoff from one sort or another.
In a way, it almost reminds me of the secret working methods of the British director Mike Leigh, who has his actors live as their characters for months, and there's improvisation and rehearsals, and from there the script is developed and built, and he's very secretive about how he works. But when you see the results, I mean, the characters just are so believable, and as they are in Christopher Guest's films.
And Mike Leigh is a little more, brusque about it. I think I saw him at a press conference once addressing this, and he said, basically, that's none of your bloody business.
That sounds consistent, having interviewed him once myself. He can be a little ornery. But the folksmen, and I presume you're referring to Harry Shearer, Michael McKean, and Christopher Guest as the trio that,
of course, who had another band, Spinal Tap, that they were 3 of the 4 members of that, and the 4th Spinal Tap member turns up in this film, an actor named Jim Piddock. I think he has a very small part, but he didn't go on to be one of the core members, I guess, of their creative team.
And because these actors took on these roles beyond these films. I mean, they would make appearances on Conan O'Brien and Letterman, and playing the characters, from Spinal Tap. Or in the case, I'm trying to think here. In the case of the Christopher Guest role. Forgive me, I'm just checking my notes here, but he would appear in character on other comedy platforms, which I thought was unusual.
Yes, indeed.
And so I'm still in awe of the talent in Mighty Wind, and I made a list of the actors and some of the characters that really stood out for me in the film. We have who are part of the so-called new mainstream singers group, John Michael Higgins as Terry Boner and Jane Lynch as his ex-porn star wife Lori. I think they're a phenomenal team, and I particularly loved her backstory, how she talked about how she met her husband and what her previous career had been like.
Yeah, that was a somewhat unlikely bit of storytelling, factually at least. They seem to be lampooning the infamous San Francisco porn producers Jim and Artie Mitchell at one point in the in some epic film of hers that she had appeared in, and then there was the hilarious line about they had gotten into some trouble, something to do with a box of Benoit balls, which recalls also Louis Buñuel's Belle de Jour. You may remember the scene with Catherine Deneuve and the Benoit balls, which may be totally unintentional, but
no, but that's to think that would have been improvised or based on improvisation is really quite remarkable. Both John Michael Higgins and Jane Lynch have been working constantly on television ever since. And there were some characters I wouldn't have minded of seeing more from, such as Parker Posey as Sissy Knox. She, of course, was very memorable in Waiting for Guffman. And she was a big presence in 1990s indie picks like Party Girl.
Mm-hmm.
And we had Fred Willard as Mike LaFontaine, the very inappropriate ex-stand-up comic who manages the Main Street Singers. We lost Fred Willard in May of 2020, which is a shame, but he was always stealing scenes in every film that he was in. I remember him in Best in Show. He was one of the commentators on the dog show who was really annoying. I believe the British co-commentator who was trying to give a very serious explanation of what was going on at the dog show. And of course, Willard was very crude in his descriptions. But for me, for A Mighty Wind, the scene where Fred Willard is introducing in the presence of the New York City deputy mayor was a comic highlight for me.
Yes.
I just thought there was some great dialogue there.
Do you know who the gentleman is who turns up really, I think, just in one scene, claiming to be some kind of folk music historian? And one of his eyes is not quite registering correctly, which
it took a while for me. That's Paul Benedict. Paul Benedict as the folk music historian who turns up in the beginning. He had appeared in a number of Milos Forman films in the 70s and Taking Off. He had a very funny cameo there. And then a very important collaborator who co-wrote the film with Christopher Guest is Eugene Levy from SCTV. That's where I knew him from originally, from the Canadian comedian who was, along with Catherine O'Hara, also an SCTV alum as Mickey, because they were Mitch and Mickey. And for me, some of the biggest laughs were when, and I think the Catherine O'Hara character is talking, or others were talking about Mitch Cohen's problems with after he broke up with Mickey as a singing act. And it was evident in his albums that he made as solos, such as Cry for Help and Calling It Quits.
Yes, those record covers are classics.
No, the record covers, the recreation of archival material.
Yes.
The
kinescopes or whatever they were.
The kinescopes. The cinematographer was Arlene Nelson, who was primarily working in TV since then, although she's turned to directing. This was her second feature as a cinematographer. It was shot in 35 millimeter, but you do have, as you mentioned, these recreations of kinescopes or cheesy 60s black and white videotape, 16 millimeter. There's some 8 millimeter recreations, all done very, very effectively. And that to me is such a skill when you're doing that, when you're satirizing culture and cultural history.
Yeah, these guys are peerless at it. And then there are some character actors whom I was not really familiar with at all. And my partner, Kathy, was watching with me, is always useful, sometimes through her daughter, in providing me explanations as to who these people are, why they're famous. The actress Jane Lynch probably was a star of the show Glee. This acerbic teacher who could, humiliate students at the drop of a hat. And also the marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And Jennifer Coolidge, who had the infamous line, "The gay people were trying to kill me," or something at the end of the HBO series. Golden Lotus, is that the name of it?
White Lotus.
White
I
Lotus.
think it's White Lotus.
Yes.
But she was one of the flaky public relations team members along with Larry Miller. I wouldn't have minded more material with the two of them. She plays Amber Cole, he plays Wally Fenton. And the DVD for A Mighty Wind has about a 22-minute outtake reel, and not so much bloopers, but just scenes that weren't used. And there was a very funny little clip with Jennifer Coolidge at that strange pre-opening party where she's saying all these flaky comments to people who are trying to engage her in small talk.
Well, I'm sure you've met a PR person or two over the years who was right on the edge of displaying, some kind of, if not contempt for their profession, a certain lack of respect for whoever's paying their fee.
I will offer a no comment to that statement, but you're very much on target.
Yeah.
We have Ed Begley Jr. as Lars Ulfen, who we saw a clip of, the television producer who has a fondness for excessive Yiddishisms.
Well, we'll leave it maybe to a listener to comment just how well he does those Yiddish. I mean, to my Gentile ear, it sounded pretty good, but
exactly,
there may be more to it.
Exactly, and Eugene Levy and Catherine O'Hara as Mitch and Miggy, of course, they've done so many other things, but SCTV in the 1980s, the timing was terrible because it was on the air right before cable. If it had been a few years later and cable had been available, it, I think, could have been much more successful. But it was dependent on network airing. And of course, it was so in contrast to what network television was doing in terms of comedy and satire. It was ahead of its time. And Levy and O'Hara are two extraordinary graduates from that amazing group of talent.
Well, as you may know, 6 or 7 years ago, Martin Scorsese started making a documentary about SCTV, including shooting a big reunion of them at one of the big theaters in Toronto on Yonge Street downtown. And it seems to have gotten put on the back burner of the many projects that he's had, documentary and feature, but it's still supposedly going to be finished at some point, but it's had an unusually long gestation period. He was a big fan apparently, and had participation from everybody who was still around. So let's hope that sees the light of day someday. They deserve it.
Absolutely, and the Christopher Guest films are very much in the spirit of what SCTV was, the satire of programming and documentaries and so forth. And you had mentioned one of the trio of the Folksmen, also from Spinal Tap, Harry Shearer, who plays Mark Shub here. He started out as a child actor in the 1950s, and then the film work began in the 1970s. There was I swear I found a credit here that I absolutely could not believe, and I will have to look for it because it was one of those, are you kidding me? Yes, okay, you know what, it was for Christopher Guest, who came from New York City. Before he turned to a director, he was an actor, and one of his earliest credits was in the Charles Bronson original Death Wish. He plays a patrolman named Riley in that film. I could barely sit through that, but now I'm kind of curious.
Well, you can catch Death Wish again next month at the Museum of Modern Art. They're doing a tribute to Paramount Pictures in the 1970s, and that film made the list. I was just looking at it the other day. I guess I first saw him in Girlfriends, Claudia Weil's film, where he played the befuddled boyfriend of Melanie Mayron, and he was actually quite good as a befuddled boyfriend. If you get a chance, take a look at his Wikipedia bio, where his British family connections are discussed in some level, and in various members of his family. And he himself now has a title. He's a lord or a sir or something. And he's also saying, well, this whole title business, it's really a bunch of bollocks. It's just, opportunism or whatever. And he's, as irreverent as ever.
I did see that, and I didn't have time to read it extensively, but that alone sounds like a perfect Christopher Guest mockumentary right there. But he had appeared in The Princess Bride, and of course, in his own films, the great character of Corky St. Clair in Waiting for Guffman, and Harlan Pepper in Best in Show, and in other films that he didn't direct, like Mrs. Henderson Presents as well. And all there, he also appeared in Ricky Gervais, also ahead of its time comedy, The Invention of Lying. So he's, and it's a shame because really Christopher Guest's last credit as a director theatrically is For Your Consideration, his spoof on Hollywood from 2006, which was the follow-up film after A Mighty Wind came out 3 years later, came For Your Consideration, also through Warner Brothers, and then unfortunately it was pretty quiet.
Well, I think there is this other film, which I hadn't even heard of until Abby pointed it out the other day, called Mascots, which is about a sports team mascot competition. I'm sure there's some humor to be mined in that, which was sold to Netflix after its completion and is available on Netflix in perpetuity, I'm sure, so we can catch up with it.
And there's also a film he made in the late 90s called Almost Heroes that I'm not familiar with, but I'm gonna have to look for. But I definitely saw his very first feature as director, which was The Big Picture, which came out in 1989. It was caught during an executive shakeup at Columbia Pictures, so it
Yes,
didn't.
that's right.
You remember that, right? And
that was one of Martin Short's first roles there. I remember, and he's interviewing the actor whose name is escaping me right now, who was in Diner and various other films, and who's he playing? Kevin Bacon. And he said,
exactly, Kevin Bacon.
He says, I don't know who you are. I don't know your name. I don't know your work, but I think you're a very, very, very talented young man. That was his opening line.
It was a very funny satire of 80s Hollywood, and Kevin Bacon's character was a film student who graduates and wants to get into the business, and he's given the runaround. And one scene I'll share with you. He's in a pitch meeting at a studio, and he's trying to pitch them a number of executives a project that's near and dear to him, and he tells them that he wants to shoot it in black and white, and they said, well, you can't do that because projectors in theaters only can run color prints.
Yeah. Well, they wish that were the case, some of those executives, I think. When another thing I liked seeing about it again today, despite the merciless onslaught of humor that comprises most of the first half of the film, as it moves along, you do feel a certain amount of it's a send up, but it's kind of a reverent send up too. I don't think that there's a sense that this music was forgettable or trash, or at least the original incarnations of it. And most of us know what they were and know who the leading artists were: the Dylans, the Seegers, the Peter, Paul, and Marys. One of whom is a regular at our theater still, as a matter of fact. One of that famous trio.
That's true, and the funny thing is, the song that Eugene Levy and Catherine O'Hara sing, A Kiss at the End of the Rainbow, was actually nominated for an Academy Award. And the two of them performed it at the Oscars in 2004. I remember at the time talking to a friend of mine, and we were saying, the song was supposed to be a joke. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously. But the Oscar voters, especially when it comes to music, usually don't understand the context of the songs, because it reminded me of when a film that you showed recently at New Plaza Cinema, Blazing Saddles, the theme song that Mel Brooks worked on, that was nominated for an Oscar as well.
Well, there's a whole genre of those, like Blame Canada from the South Park movie, which is wound up.
Precisely. So I'd also remember when I first saw Mighty Wind during this concert at Town Hall, you see the various groups are performing, and the new Main Street Singers are doing this very catchy country and western patter song called Potatoes in the Paddy Wagon. And you see little snips of it, and they're performing it brilliantly. All the actors, Parker Posey and John Michael Higgins and Jane Lynch, and they keep cutting away from the song. And I remember saying, God, I'd like to hear the whole number. Well, the DVD of Mighty Wind actually has a 22-minute extra. It's a videotape production of the show within the show. So you get to see all the musical numbers performed without interruption, including Potatoes in the Paddy Wagon. So for me, that was like finding one of the missing scenes from The Magnificent Ambersons. I was so thrilled to see that the other night. You and I, we've debated in the past a little bit about Robert Altman's Nashville, and the music in Nashville, as I recall, was intended to not be good. The songs were intended not to be good.
I don't know if I see it that way. I don't think that they set it. I don't think those songs were set out to parody. Certainly not Keith Carradine's songs.
Not Keith Carradine.
And not Ronnie Blakely's, and even a few of them, maybe one or two that I would say maybe are a little bit goofy, but I don't know. I think that's well, you can take another look at Nashville. It's in that Paramount series next month as well.
Well, because my thing was when I had seen the last time I saw Nashville a number of years ago, I was saying to myself, I didn't believe the characters, the country and Western performers in that film could have gotten bookings in Nashville. I don't think they were good enough as performers. That was my complaint. But
that could be,
but in A Mighty Wind, I believed all of these people could get bookings. I think the actors were so outstanding in their performances, their singing and the playing of the instruments. I presume they're really playing instruments. I didn't do enough research.
That doesn't look fake at all. And on the credits, every song is an original. There are no covers or anything. It's all by somebody in the cast or by some collaboration of. There's an actress that we liked in the 70s and 80s, Annette O'Toole. I think she's the wife of one of the principal players, and maybe somebody will point that out to us as we've had already today. She has a co-songwriting credit on 2 or 3 of the songs as well.
So you've got these original songs, and they're playing their instruments and they're singing brilliantly. I mean, I actually could see them getting bookings. Dan Cahill has raised his hand. Dan, please.
Dan is going to. I have a feeling he's going to set us straight as he indispensably often does.
I will be curious to know, because I don't really know the folk movie universe, perhaps as well as you do, who some of the groups or performers might have served as the influence for these satires. I mean, was there particular groups that were being kept in mind?
Yes. I know you and Gary are all too young to have experienced this when you were, say, in high school, like I did. There's a group of 3 men, and I believe they would probably refer to the Kingston Trio, who were hugely influential with top #1 songs on the hit parade, including Tom Dooley. I don't know if you remember that song. It was just sort of a catchy melody. The big group, the New Main Street Singers, did I remember that name right?
Yes.
There was a large group called the New Christie Minstrels, and they had a lot of TV airplay. I believe they had guest shots on Mitch Miller, which was a favorite sing-along program at home.
Yeah. Bastardization of a lot of good music, as I recall. Sing along with Mitch.
Yeah.
But a generation of Americans grew up knowing these famous songs from the American Songbook, courtesy of Mitch Miller.
That's right.
No, true. But, they were all singing in unison on Mitch Miller. There were no parts being sung. I mean, it was as boring as they could possibly make it. So
I think the Weavers are also referenced here as well, I think.
Probably. The Weavers were early pioneers. They were in the mid 50s, I believe. Pete Seeger was with them for a long time. Let's see. I was also going to reference, Max and I had a conversation about this, and the people who really, really had major hits with folk songs were Peter, Paul, and Mary, and they had a very long and prosperous career. I think one of them might still be alive. Peter,
he's a regular in our theater, as I mentioned earlier.
You're making a narrative film using the idea of a documentary where it's a camera crew following people around, capturing them in their natural state, so to speak, and cobbling together a story from that. Peter Watkins, really was one of the grandfathers of the mockumentary, the political mockumentary in England, with films like The War Game and also Punishment Park in the late 60s and early 70s. And then F for Fake by Orson Welles in the early 70s. That was a bit of a mockumentary.
Yep.
Peter Greenaway did The Falls, which was a mockumentary.
There's an American filmmaker, and this film shows up from regularly in cinemas in New York. I've only seen it once. Maybe you have. His name is Bill Greaves, and the film has a very strange title, Symbiotoxoplasm Take One, or something, which is
Symbiotoxoplasm Take One.
Yes.
And it was a very expensive avant-garde movie that you're absolutely right. That was ahead of the curve. It actually beat the other films to the punch in satirizing a documentary that's being made in Central Park.
And somebody, maybe the Film Foundation or one of those groups, has really sort of looked after this film. It was restored, and it plays around in one cinema or another in New York. I think it's coming up maybe in the next month or two. I saw it on somebody's calendar, so worth checking out. It's on Criterion too, I think.
Very much worth checking out, and an important addition. And of course, moving to the 80s, we have Woody Allen's Zelig, which was a mockumentary.
That's true.
We had Tim Robbins's Bob Roberts,
That's right.
And of course, various films by Sacha Baron Cohen. I mean, you want to talk about politically incorrect.
Right.
Borat and Bruno are two examples of that. So there's been quite a number of directors captivated by that format. Any theories as to why that might be?
Well, when it works, it's great. To me, it seems dauntingly tough to pull off. I really admire these guys who can do it.
Absolutely. Well, I tell you what, let's now see if we can hear from our guest today. Laurie, our host, can assist us in taking questions from the audience.
Hi, everyone. Joshua, do you want to unmute and start your video, please?
You were talking about the Weavers. The founder of the Weavers was a guy who ran a camp up in on the Hudson, and my wife was camp director of that camp and got to know him very, very well. Also, as a coincidence, you were talking about Peter, Paul, and Mary. Well, my daughter went to nursery school with Peter Yarrow's daughter, so we ran into him that way too. It's just a small world.
It is a small world.
By the way, thank you again very much for this series. I always have fun and always learn a lot. So it's great seeing you.
Thank you so much, Joshua.
Thanks, Joshua.
See you soon.
Okay, Jonathan, your hand is up.
Two things. Again, regarding the Weavers, they were actually started in the 1930s, but certainly in the 1940s, because by the 50s with the Red Scare, in particular, but not just one. And the other thing is, I'm wondering if Mitch and Mickey were not patterned somewhat off of Ian and Sylvia, which were also a Canadian folk group.
See, this is why we count on you people in the audience who know these things. That's a great piece of information.
I mean, it's a different style, but they were folk, but I think they were a little later than most of these other people. And by the way, I absolutely love this movie, and I do love it more than Best in Show. I have a brother who will swear by that one. My wife and I will swear by this one.
Two different camps. I love it.
There's plenty to go around for everyone.
Right.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Jonathan. If I could just add my two cents, as someone who used to work in this industry doing art department and wardrobe, the forethought that has to go into recreating those things. When you guys talked about the budget, that kind of costs a lot of money. It really has to be thought through so thoroughly that even though maybe a lot of it is improv, that part of it can't be, and just the attention to detail and period specificity. So, it's hard work.
No, it is hard work, and I'm in awe of people who can get those details, and especially, as you say, they're recreating television programs from the 1960s that has to look convincing. Because those are the things I always look for. Does that really look convincing? And they did a very good job, I think.
And they have to get the talent there to recreate it, unless, well, I doubt they just photoshopped it back in 2003. But yeah, you got to pay the talent to do that too. They don't show up for free.
Very good point.
I think Joshua had one more point. Joshua?
When did the Simon and Garfunkel era come into being?
60s.
Mid 60s.
Yeah, 64, 65 was the first album.
That's when I was in school.
Because by the time The Graduate came out, The Sound of Silence was already a well-known song. It wasn't created for the film in 67. They'd been around a while. But yes, they're definitely in the spirit of some of these other performers.
Well, Mickey and Mitch almost remind me of Dylan and Joan Baez to a certain extent, although they were never a duo per se on stage, although I have seen them both perform together. But yeah, so they kind of reminded me of that, those two, and the backstory.
Yeah, the lyrics to that song about catheters that she's singing at the end there, that sent us out on a note of hilarity. Yeah. Uncomfortable hilarity.
And if you want to see the uncut version of that song, the DVD extra has the entire song, I believe. So.
Well, I think that's another brilliant and aspect that we just look over with these kinds of films, because I've actually seen Spinal Tap in concert, like at the Hard Rock. Like they have albums, so it sort of adds to the mythology, if you will. And of course, leading up to, as Gary pointed out, Spinal Tap 2 is coming around the corner. So,
and you reminded me, another thing that occurred to me when I was watching A Mighty Wind is it made me sad, because the songs were intended to be satires and spoofs. If those songs were written today for a Broadway show, they would win awards, they'd be taken seriously, because I think the quality of songwriting has plummeted in popular entertainment, at least in this country. And I can't imagine it was effortless writing on their part, but the intelligence that went into writing this music by all these actors, it's almost becoming a lost art, I think.